Alyssa Carter stepped into the lobby of a small branch of Carter & Co. Financial, a bank she had founded years ago. The late afternoon sun streamed through the glass windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. As the automatic doors slid open, a soft whoosh accompanied her entrance. The rhythmic tap of her sneakers against the floor was almost lost beneath the hum of everyday transactions. Adjusting her cardigan over her shoulders, Alyssa looked around, not as a CEO, not as an industry leader, but simply as a customer. She had no urgent meetings, no high-stakes negotiations, just a simple withdrawal from her personal account. The kind of mundane transaction that thousands of people conducted every day. This was Carter & Co. Financial, the company Alyssa had built from the ground up with a vision of fairness and accessibility. She had weathered countless storms to ensure that customers, no matter their background, were always treated with respect. This branch, in particular, held special significance. She had personally scouted the location, approved its launch, and even held the ceremonial ribbon cutting on opening day. But today, she was not here in a tailored suit with heels clicking sharply against the marble. She was in jeans and sneakers, blending in with the crowd. She didn't want deference or special treatment, just to be assured that her bank upheld the values it claimed to stand for. Alyssa approached the counter with a neutral expression, her posture relaxed. The young teller behind the desk barely acknowledged her, glancing at her only briefly before refocusing on her computer screen. Alyssa cleared her throat gently. "Hi, I'd like to make a withdrawal," she said, her tone polite but firm. The teller, Madison Wells, didn't look up. Instead, she pushed a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out," she said flatly. Alyssa took the clipboard, glancing at the simple form, name, account number, withdrawal amount. She quickly wrote down $5,000, a sum large enough to require identification but by no means unusual. She slid the form and her ID back across the counter, expecting a smooth process. Instead, something shifted. Madison's eyes flicked between the form, the ID, and the computer screen. A moment of hesitation, a slight tightening of her lips. The kind of pause that wouldn't mean anything to most people, but Alyssa knew better. "Can you hold on a second?" Madison asked, her voice uncertain now. She picked up Alyssa's ID and disappeared behind the frosted glass door leading to the back office. Alyssa exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers against the marble counter. This wasn't the kind of interaction she had expected. A few moments later, Madison returned, but she wasn't alone. The branch manager, Ethan Porter, stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He was middle-aged, with an expression that seemed carefully measured, neither warm nor particularly welcoming. "Good afternoon, Miss Carter," Ethan said with a stiff smile. His eyes flickered over her appearance briefly before settling on the form she had submitted. "I understand you're making a withdrawal?" Alyssa nodded. "Yes, $5,000 from my personal account." Ethan hesitated, then extended a hand. "May I see your ID again?" Alyssa's brow furrowed slightly. "I already gave it to Madison." Her tone remained steady, though a flicker of irritation rose inside her. Ethan didn't acknowledge her comment. Instead, he took the ID from Madison and held it up to the light, tilting it as if searching for signs of forgery. The move was subtle, but Alyssa caught the implication immediately. She had been a customer at Carter & Co. Financial for years. There was no reason for this level of scrutiny. After a pause, Ethan asked, "What do you do for work, Miss Carter?" Alyssa's jaw tightened slightly. "I run a financial firm," she replied, her voice cool but pointed. Ethan gave a slow nod, exchanging a glance with Madison before asking another question. "Is this withdrawal from a personal account or a business one?" Alyssa exhaled sharply through her nose. "It's right there on the form," she said, her patience thinning. Ethan turned the ID over in his hands, his eyes scanning it like he was searching for a flaw. The air in the room shifted, something unspoken settling into the space between them. Madison remained silent, standing stiffly beside him. She wasn't intervening, wasn't speaking up, just watching. Alyssa had seen this before, people questioning her authority, doubting her position. But never here. Never in her own bank. Ethan finally looked back up, his expression still unreadable. "Miss Carter, I'll need to ask you a few more questions before we can proceed with the transaction," he said smoothly. But there was something else in his tone, something that didn't sit right. Alyssa forced herself to remain calm. And just to clarify, Ethan continued, "Is this your first time banking with us?" Alyssa felt her stomach tighten. This was not a new branch. She had founded this bank. She had personally signed off on every detail of this very location. Her expression remained composed, but her voice was now steel. "I've banked here since the day this branch opened." Ethan didn't respond right away. He seemed to weigh her words, considering his next move. Then, after a pause, he asked again, "And you said you're withdrawing $5,000? His tone was slow, deliberate, like the sum needed to be justified. Alyssa's patience was hanging by a thread. "Yes, you've seen the form. You have my ID. Everything is in order." She leveled her gaze at him. "So what's the issue, Ethan?" Ethan hesitated again. Then carefully he said, "I'm going to need you to verify some additional information before we can process this withdrawal." Alyssa blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Additional information?" she echoed, incredulous. "I've already provided my ID, my account number. What else could you possibly need?" Ethan shifted slightly. "It's just a precaution," he said smoothly. Alyssa's grip on the counter tightened. A precaution. She had been patient. She had given them the benefit of the doubt. But this wasn't standard protocol. This wasn't about security. This was about something else. She took a slow breath, controlling the sharp edge of frustration threatening to rise in her voice. "Ethan," she said coolly, "I've complied with every requirement. So tell me, are you following protocol? Or are you questioning whether I belong here?" Ethan hesitated. The lobby had grown quieter now. The usual hum of conversation had dimmed, leaving behind an almost uncomfortable silence. Alyssa's gaze remained locked on Ethan, her patience unraveling. This wasn't about procedure anymore. It was about something much bigger. And she was done playing along. Alyssa Carter's stomach tightened at Ethan Porter's question. "Have you banked with us before?" The words sounded casual, but she could hear the calculated tone behind them. This wasn't a new branch. She had built it from the ground up. She had signed off on the location, approved every interior design detail, and had personally overseen the hiring process for every employee, including, ironically, Ethan himself. Her jaw clenched. This wasn't about verifying a simple transaction. This was about something deeper. "I've banked here since the day this branch opened," Alyssa stated, her voice unwavering. Ethan didn't immediately respond. His eyes flickered toward Madison Wells, the teller, before shifting back to Alyssa. He seemed to be measuring his next move, calculating how much further he could push this unnecessary line of questioning. And then, as if confirming her suspicions, he spoke again. "And you're withdrawing $5,000? Ethan repeated slowly, his tone laced with skepticism. "Can you remind me what you do for work, Miss Carter?" Alyssa's patience wavered for the first time. Hadn't she already answered this? What was the point of this dance? She had made it clear she worked in finance. She had built Carter & Co. Financial from nothing into a thriving institution. She lifted her chin slightly. "I run a financial firm." Ethan hesitated, his fingers tapping against the form as if weighing his next words. Then, with another glance at Madison, he pressed further. "What kind of financial firm?" Alyssa exhaled slowly, controlling the frustration rising in her chest. This wasn't a security check. It was an interrogation. She took a step forward, keeping her tone measured. "I own this bank, Ethan," she said, enunciating every word. "I founded Carter & Co. Financial." A beat of silence followed. Alyssa watched as the weight of her words settled over him. For a moment there was a flicker of uncertainty in his posture, but he quickly masked it. He wasn't asking because he didn't know. He was testing her, looking for any excuse to deny her request. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he glanced back at the withdrawal slip in his hands. His expression remained unreadable. "I see," he muttered, though it was clear he didn't. Alyssa's patience was hanging by a thread. "Is this a personal account or a business account?" Ethan asked again, as if she hadn't already written it on the form in front of him. Alyssa inhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain composed. "It's a personal account," she answered, voice barely controlled. "Everything you need is right there." She motioned toward the document, the irritation slipping into her tone now. "So again, what's the issue, Ethan?" Madison shifted nervously beside him, her gaze darting between them, but she said nothing. It was clear she understood what was happening, but she wasn't about to intervene. Ethan, however, seemed completely unfazed. Instead of responding, he continued studying the form, his fingers tracing the details slowly, deliberately, as if looking for a mistake that wasn't there. Alyssa could see it now. He wasn't just verifying information. He was trying to make her prove she belonged here. Alyssa stood motionless, arms crossed loosely over her chest. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. So, Ethan repeated, his tone almost taunting, "You're withdrawing $5,000 from your personal account?" His eyes locked onto her, scanning her expression as if trying to gauge whether she would waver under pressure. "Is that correct?" Alyssa's gaze didn't waver. "Yes," she answered firmly. "You've seen the form. Everything is in order." Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned the form over in his hands, his fingers brushing the edges as if expecting some hidden flaw to reveal itself. But there was none. The lobby had grown quieter now. Customers and employees alike seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, the tension thickening with every passing second. Finally, Ethan looked up, his expression shifting ever so slightly. "I'm going to need you to verify some additional information before we can proceed with the withdrawal," he said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. Alyssa blinked. "Additional information?" she repeated. "I've already provided everything. My ID, my account number. What more do you need?" Ethan hesitated for the first time, his fingers still resting against the form. Then, as if sensing his own hesitation, he doubled down. "Can you tell me the amount of your last deposit to this account?" Alyssa's fingers curled against the edge of the counter. That wasn't standard procedure. In fact, she knew it wasn't even a common security measure for large withdrawals. If she had been withdrawing a much larger sum, perhaps a secondary verification would make sense. But this was different. Her voice was cold now. "I don't have that number memorized," she said, though she knew it wouldn't matter. "You have my account right there in front of you. You can pull up the details just like you would for anyone else." Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if processing her words, but his eyes were still calculating, still searching for a way to make her prove she had access to her own money. The realization hit her fully now. This wasn't about security. This was about assumptions. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his voice deceptively smooth. "We take security very seriously, Miss Carter," he said, as if reading from a script. "It's just a precaution." Alyssa let out a slow breath, leveling him with an icy stare. "A precaution," she repeated, voice laced with disbelief. Ethan said nothing. Her fingers tapped once against the counter, a calculated move as she studied him. She had been patient. She had given him the benefit of the doubt. But this wasn't protocol. This wasn't about protecting customer assets. This was something else entirely. "Tell me something, Ethan," she said, her voice steady but sharp now. "If I had walked in here today wearing a tailored suit instead of sneakers and a cardigan, would we still be having this conversation?" A flicker of discomfort crossed his face, but it was gone just as quickly. "I'm simply following policy," he replied smoothly. Alyssa's lips pressed together. Policy. It was always policy when it came to people like her. A slow realization settled over her. He had already made up his mind about her before she even walked through the door. And now, he was trying to make sure she knew her place. Alyssa exhaled once, steadying herself. Then, slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Without breaking eye contact, she unlocked it and hit record. The moment the camera clicked on, the entire energy of the room shifted. The hum of conversation in the background dimmed. The security guard standing nearby shifted slightly. Even Madison seemed to tense. "You're refusing to allow me access to my own account," Alyssa stated clearly, her voice calm, unwavering. Despite providing a government-issued ID, while other customers aren't being asked to do the same. Ethan's face paled slightly. She had been silent before. Now, everyone in the lobby was watching. And Alyssa Carter had no intention of backing down. Alyssa Carter held her ground, her fingers pressing against the cold marble counter as the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. This isn't about policy. This isn't about security. This is about something else. Across from her, Ethan Porter remained unmoved, his fingers still tracing the edges of the withdrawal slip, his gaze lingering on her ID as if he was searching for something, an inconsistency, a flaw, a reason to deny her. But there was none. I don't have that number memorized, Alyssa said, her voice controlled but sharp. But you have my account information right there. You can pull it up just like you would for anyone else. Ethan didn't acknowledge her words. He simply nodded as though processing her response, but his calculating stare told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't processing anything. He was stalling. Alyssa felt her patience stretch to its breaking point. Then came the rehearsed line. "We take security very seriously, Miss Carter," Ethan said, his tone measured and professional, but entirely impersonal. "It's just a precaution." Her grip on the counter tightened. "A precaution?" she echoed, her voice edged with disbelief. "What exactly are you trying to say here, Ethan?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached to the side and grabbed a clipboard, sliding it toward her. "It's just policy," he said smoothly. "We need to verify that you're the account holder before we can process the withdrawal." Alyssa stared at the clipboard without touching it. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the absurdity unfolding in front of her. She had been coming to this branch since day one. She had literally opened this bank. Yet here she was, being asked to prove, again, that she belonged. Her ID wasn't enough. Her account number wasn't enough. Her years of history with Carter & Co. Financial, the bank she had built, weren't enough. She exhaled slowly, reining in her frustration. "You're telling me that my government-issued ID, my account number, and my personal banking history aren't enough?" Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. "You're making me prove that I'm entitled to my own money?" Ethan's expression didn't shift. He simply repeated himself with the same detached professionalism. "It's just procedure." Alyssa narrowed her eyes. She had been patient. She had given him every opportunity to do the right thing, but this was crossing a line, one she wasn't going to let him get away with. Under her breath, she muttered, "I don't believe this." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but still held his ground. He pushed the clipboard toward her again with a calculated politeness that sent a surge of irritation through her. "You can fill out the form again if you'd like," he said, his voice far too smooth, as if this was nothing more than an insignificant inconvenience. "It's just part of the process." Alyssa didn't move. She didn't reach for the clipboard. She didn't play into the game. Instead, she stood there, watching him, letting the weight of the moment settle into the air between them. Her heart pounded, but her face remained impassive. She had spent too many years fighting to be taken seriously to let this man see her frustration. She wasn't going to fill out another form. She wasn't going to validate this charade. Not here. Not in her own damn bank. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Then, with precise control, she spoke. "Ethan," she said, her voice cold and deliberate, "this is ridiculous. I've been with this bank since day one. I helped open this branch, and now you're making me prove that I belong here?" For the first time she saw it, a flicker of unease in his expression. He was beginning to realize who he was dealing with. She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough to make him lean in. "You might want to check again," she said smoothly, "because I'm not just any customer." Ethan remained frozen. Alyssa reached into her bag, her fingers curling around her phone. In one swift motion, she pulled it out and lifted it, hitting record. The silence in the lobby thickened. Tension crackled in the air as heads turned. Customers who had only half glanced at the scene before were watching now, sensing something was happening, but unsure of exactly what. Alyssa's camera focused directly on Ethan. "You're refusing to allow me access to my own account," she stated, her voice clear, unwavering. "Despite me providing government-issued identification, while other customers aren't being asked for anything extra." Ethan paled slightly. His carefully composed mask faltered for the first time. Alyssa shifted the camera slightly, turning it toward the security guard who had been standing silently by. His hands rested near his belt, not threatening, but present. "And you," she said, her tone even. "You were called over. For what reason exactly?" The security guard hesitated, glancing at Ethan before looking back at Alyssa. He didn't speak immediately, clearly caught between two conflicting orders, his duty and the mess he had just stepped into. Alyssa didn't give him time to sidestep the question. "Answer me." The guard shifted his weight. "I'm just here to make sure everything goes smoothly," he said finally, his voice careful. Alyssa's gaze didn't waver. "Make sure everything goes smoothly," she repeated, letting the words settle before continuing. Or make sure I understand my place? The guard's throat bobbed slightly as he swallowed. Ethan looked increasingly uncomfortable, his hands pressing against the counter as if grounding himself. Alyssa could see it now. He had lost control of the situation. She lowered her phone slightly but kept it recording. "You've made a big mistake, Ethan," she said coolly, his lips pressed into a tight line. "Miss Carter, if you'd just calm down." Alyssa cut him off. "I am calm," she said, her voice like ice. "But you've decided that I don't belong here, and now you get to deal with the consequences." Silence. She turned slightly, making eye contact with the customers behind her. They were listening now. They were seeing it, the reality, the humiliation, the bias that had been hiding in plain sight. Ethan swallowed. His eyes darted to Madison, then back to the security guard. He was losing control fast, and he knew it. Then, in a final desperate move, Ethan reached beneath the counter. Alyssa immediately recognized the motion. A silent alarm. He was calling for backup. A few moments later, another security officer entered the lobby, taller, broader, more imposing. His eyes swept the room before landing on her. Alyssa didn't flinch. She turned her camera toward him. "So this is how you handle customer service," she said, her voice sharp now. "Instead of following policy, you call security on a woman withdrawing money from her own account?" The entire bank was watching. The security guard hesitated. He had expected to walk into a scene, but now he was the scene. Alyssa inhaled deeply. Then, slowly, deliberately, she said, "Process my withdrawal, Ethan, or watch this go viral." The ball was in his court now, and she wasn't blinking first. Alyssa Carter refused to move. The weight of the moment pressed down on the entire room, thickening the air, making every movement, every breath feel calculated. The bank lobby, once bustling with quiet conversations and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, had fallen silent. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Porter, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before Alyssa's eyes. He had thought he could control the situation. He had thought that by applying just enough pressure, by throwing just enough roadblocks in her path, he could make her doubt herself, make her back down. But what he hadn't counted on was who she was. She wasn't just any customer. She wasn't just another account holder walking in off the street. She was the reason this branch even existed. And now, she was making damn sure that everyone knew it. Alyssa saw the moment Ethan realized he had made a fatal mistake. The instant recognition flashed across his face. The subtle way his shoulders tensed. The quick glance he shot toward the bank's security guard, as if begging for backup that wasn't coming. And yet, instead of correcting himself, he doubled down. Without a word, Ethan's hand disappeared beneath the counter. Alyssa's stomach twisted. She knew what that meant. He was calling for another escalation. Alyssa inhaled sharply, refusing to let the flicker of disbelief show on her face. Is he really willing to take it this far? And then, before she could react, the door to the back office swung open. A second uniformed security officer stepped into the lobby. He was taller, broader than the first, his polished badge catching the light, his stance rigid, his hands carefully positioned near his belt. He didn't say anything right away. He didn't need to. His presence was the message. Alyssa let the tension settle before she spoke. Her voice was calm, but razor sharp. "So this is how you're handling things, Ethan?" she asked, her words slicing through the silence. "You refuse to process a basic transaction and instead, you call 2 security officers to deal with me?" The new guard hesitated. Alyssa tilted her head slightly, watching him closely. "Tell me," she continued, turning her camera toward him. "What exactly is your role in this? Are you here to assist a customer, or are you here to make sure I understand my place?" The officer shifted on his feet. I'm just here to keep things under control," he said finally, his voice measured, as if he himself wasn't sure how to respond. Alyssa let out a slow breath, tapping her fingers lightly against the counter. "Under control," she echoed, her voice eerily even. "Control of what exactly? Because last I checked, the only thing happening here is you refusing to process a withdrawal from my personal account." Her words hung in the air, and then, without warning, she took a deliberate step forward. The entire room tensed. She felt it, the shift in energy, the way eyes darted from her to Ethan, to the guards, to the other employees standing completely still, waiting to see what would happen next. But Alyssa didn't stop. Instead, she slowly reached for the counter, where her ID still lay, untouched, the very thing Ethan had been obsessively scrutinizing for the past 20 minutes. She picked it up and turned it over in her hand, and then, ever so deliberately, she tapped it against the marble surface. Once, twice. "You see this?" she asked, her voice still dangerously smooth. "This isn't just any customer's ID." She let the moment stretch. Then she dropped the bombshell. "This is the founder and CEO of Carter & Co. Financial." Silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Alyssa could see the moment it hit Ethan, the way his eyes widened slightly before he forced them back to neutral, as if he could somehow recover from this. But he couldn't. It was too late. The security officers exchanged a quick glance. The first one, who had been standing there since the beginning, visibly stiffened, as if suddenly realizing the weight of his actions. Even Madison, the young teller, looked like she wanted to disappear. Alyssa exhaled once, shaking her head slightly. "You've spent the last 20 minutes treating me like a fraud," she said, never breaking eye contact with Ethan. "You humiliated me. You questioned my credentials. You refused to follow basic banking protocol." Her voice hardened. "And now you've called security on your own boss." Ethan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Alyssa let the silence stretch. Then, calmly, she placed her ID back on the counter and folded her arms across her chest. "So tell me, Ethan," she said, her voice dangerously low. "What are you going to do now?" Ethan didn't speak. Not right away. For the first time, he looked lost. His hands twitched against the counter, his posture rigid. He opened his mouth, probably to attempt some half-hearted explanation, but no sound came out. The customers were still watching. The security officers weren't moving. And Alyssa? She had all the power now. She tilted her head slightly. "Well?" Ethan's hands shook as he finally reached for the keyboard. Alyssa watched as he typed in her account number, his fingers clumsy, uncertain, and for the first time all day he didn't question her withdrawal. Alyssa exhaled slowly. She had won. But she wasn't done yet. Once Ethan had processed the withdrawal, Alyssa took the cash and placed it in her bag without a word. Then she turned to the security officers. "You," she said, nodding toward the one who had arrived last. "If a customer isn't causing a disturbance, you don't escalate. You don't show up ready for conflict. Learn to tell the difference between a security risk and a manager with a bias problem." The officer had the decency to look ashamed. Then she turned back to Madison. "And you," she said, her voice still firm but slightly softer. "You had every opportunity to do the right thing, but instead, you followed Ethan's lead." Madison's face burned red. She nodded quickly, unable to meet Alyssa's gaze. And finally, Alyssa turned to Ethan. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, "You had a choice," she said simply, "and you made the wrong one." She let those words sink in before she turned on her heel and walked toward the door. She didn't have to look back to know that the moment she was gone, Ethan would probably run to his office, scrambling for damage control. But there was no fixing this. Not for him. Not for anyone who thought they could treat people like she didn't belong. And the next morning? She made damn sure that this never happened again. By sunrise, Alyssa had already scheduled an emergency leadership meeting. Every branch manager was called in, every customer service policy was reviewed, and as for Ethan Porter? Fired. On the spot. Mandatory bias training was implemented across all branches. A new accountability system was introduced, and Carter & Co. Financials saw immediate change, because this wasn't just a one-time correction, this was a reckoning. And Alyssa Carter? She was exactly the kind of person to make it happen.